Welcome, everybody. I hope you've all got drinks. I have, yes. I've got the option of a drink. That's good. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor here at Tortoise. It's great to see so many of you have actually made the in real world, in IRL, in real life, trek to our newsroom. We're joined by some other people online. And we're joined more specifically by Dr. Julia Grace Patterson. And I'm going to see if I can remember all your different titles. Medical doctor, first of all. Founder and chief executive of EveryDoctor and author of Critical: Why the NHS is Being Betrayed and How We Can Fight for It. It is a goldmine of detail about what's going on in the NHS. For me, it's also, I have to say, a little depressing because I have a son who's just qualified for medical school after 4 years of trying. And to read it and think about what you went through as a junior doctor, what all the other junior doctors go through, and the prognosis for the service, and wonder about that as a workplace for someone that close to me. Yeah. You know, I'm sure many of us have had these kinds of thoughts. But anyway, before we get into it on everything that's on your mind and in your book, ground rules. This is it's builders in conversation with, but it's a ThinkIn. We're going to run it like a Tortoise ThinkIn. So please, all of you, raise your hand at any point. You don't have to wait till the end. Please don't wait till the end, because then you'll think of things that you wanted to say and there won't be any time for it. That yellow tortoise will tell us how we're doing in relation to the time. And when the flag goes up at the end, it's kind of time up. So if there's anything that you want to ask or just say, which you think I'm not getting to, or even if I am, or if I'm getting it wrong, just pitch in. But broadly speaking, Julia, your analysis, it's pretty uncompromising. It is that the health service is collapsing. Not only that, but that it's deliberate in a sense. It's as a result of policy over many decades, but principally recently, and that it needs to go back to its roots if it's to survive, keeping to its existing constitution. Can you start by outlining for us how you see that collapse happening? What are the ingredients of that collapse? And you were saying just before we came up from downstairs that quite a lot of the work that you're doing with EveryDoctor is on newly observed systemic problems, which you see. Tell us about them, but more broadly, sketch out how you see the services collapsing.
Okay, so just to clarify first, I'm not currently working as a medical doctor. I always like to say, yes, I am qualified. I always like to say that, just because there are many doctors in the audience here today, and they're doing such an amazing job. So I'm not working on the front line. Just want to state that. Okay, so the really big question, and I've covered it in the book, but we've, at EveryDoctor, we've been tackling systemic problems in the NHS for the last 4 years or so now. And when we started, we were a small collective of UK doctors who saw problems and saw that individuals working in the service or individual hospitals were being scapegoated for problems which weren't specific to those individuals or workplaces. They actually were systemic problems. And so if there was a failure in one place, for example, an A&E was overrun, or a maternity unit, had understaffing, or there were failures with ambulances arriving in the hospital, or any of these things, we found through the network that we were building that the same thing would be happening in multiple places across England, but also across the entire UK. And what we became interested in doing is highlighting the fact that these systemic problems needed to be tackled. And so we had a really firm focus on trying to involve politicians from across the political spectrum in our work, bringing stories to the press and calling for solutions. And we did that pretty diligently for 3-4 years. We've run over 25 parliamentary briefings. We ran a really big campaign during the pandemic that was called Protect NHS Workers, and we worked with over 100 MPs across the political spectrum. We've got a lot of experience now looking at what happens when you call attention to a problem, which is systemic, and then how politicians react. And we have a really wide network of people who get involved in these campaigns. We run a network of about 400,000 people. And what we have noticed happen over the last 2 years, probably since the pandemic, is there's been a shift where politicians are less engaging in the problems in the service. During the pandemic, there were opportunities for us to campaign and do cross-party work and make changes. We secured some changes.
You describe in the book how those briefings were attended by dozens of MPs from both parties.
Yeah, we started small. It was an enormous challenge because all of the MPs were working from home. We assembled a team of volunteers. We telephoned every single MP office every single week. It was an extraordinary task that happened when, no one was used to Zoom, right? But, we started with maybe 20 MPs coming, and then it was 30, and then it was 40, and then it was 50. And I still maintain links with a lot of those MPs. There are some fantastic politicians in this country, but the parties are not working to change the things systemically that need to be changed. And sorry, to answer the question that you put to me, because we've been doing this work now for 3 or 4 years, and we've been picking up on the problems each time and running these briefings and monitoring who attends and who doesn't, and who lobbies in Parliament and who doesn't, and what questions are asked in Prime Minister's questions, all of these things. We've got an absolute mine of information about how the political parties are responding. And as we came into the winter that we've just come out of, we recognised through our network that things were going to be really, really bad this winter. So much so that we prepped a campaign ahead of time. We prepped it in October that was called Revive the NHS. And we worked with lots of artists, animators, filmmakers to create materials ahead of time because we knew it was going to be a terrible situation and we wanted to get prepared and raise the alarm about what was happening. And we ran 3 emergency parliamentary briefings over the winter period. Now, I bet people here will remember what happened, but the NHS truly did collapse this winter. We had a situation... Sorry, Giles.
No, I'm sort of sharp intake of breath because I'm just being a pedant here. And one of my jobs here is sort of to edit people's copy. If it had truly collapsed, then it kind of wouldn't exist anymore. My question is, what are the key components of this collapse? Are we talking about... we're all familiar with the headlines, aren't we? The waiting lists, the time spent waiting for emergency care, the backlogs for elective surgeries. What do you think is the most valid way of quantifying the health or ill health of the service?
So first of all, I think there's a problem with us talking about one NHS crisis one winter and then another NHS crisis, and it kind of takes on this sort of monotonous energy about it. And we talk about waiting lists and we talk about time waiting for an ambulance. But what gets lost when that is the discussion is what is happening in that intervening time. Because if you think about it, if you're asking how do we quantify whether this service is working or not, the NHS is meant to provide safe, comprehensive, effective care for every person in this country. And this winter we had a situation where people were calling ambulances that didn't turn up before they died. We had a situation, our members told us what was going on day to day. It was absolutely horrifying. There were A&E doctors telling us that the beds were being pulled out of bed spaces to enable 6 or 7 chairs to be put in each cubicle. There was life-saving treatment being delivered on the floor of the A&E department. There was situations where there weren't enough beds on wards, and so they were ramming extra beds up against the fire exits. Those beds didn't have any access to oxygen. We had GPs telling us that patients had had a severe fall at home and were turning up at the GP 3 days later with a broken hip because the ambulance had never turned up. There were up to 500 patients dying every single week because they couldn't access urgent care, and that's from the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. And so that, to my mind, is the collapse of our healthcare system, and that is what needs to be spoken about. And it's not being spoken about because politicians don't want to talk about it. That's not just the current government. We haven't found any party who are wanting to talk about that, and that's why I've written the book. And actually, what was really difficult this winter... Sorry, whenever I talk about this, I cry because I find it really, really difficult. It was incredibly difficult running a network of people hearing from doctors on the front line about what was going on, running these emergency parliamentary briefings, turning up and bringing frontline doctors to these meetings when they had 1,000 other things they could have been doing for their patients those days, and recognising that a dozen MPs turned up, or 15 MPs. There's 650 MPs in the UK. Where were the other 630 MPs? Because it was a humanitarian crisis.
And was there a point towards the end of the pandemic when you sensed that bipartisan, to use the American phrase, political interest from MPs dissolving and going to the current situation which you describe of much lower levels of interest and senior politicians from both parties refusing to engage with what you see as the gravity of the argument? I mean, did that roughly coincide with the end of the pandemic? Did everyone just heave a sigh of relief?
I think it's more complicated than that. The pandemic definitely does play into it a lot. So when the pandemic started up, because it was such an extraordinary event, there was the sense that politicians were acting out of what they thought was right. And we noticed that there was a lot of cross-party working on emergency issues, like, for example, the provision of safe PPE, the provision of death in service benefit. We saw lots of MPs lobbying together about mental health care provision for the staff, this sort of thing. It was actually really impressive. The barriers seemed to come down between political parties. Now, I'm probably being slightly generous because the Conservative Party had a handful of politicians doing that. I think very highly of them. You know, I was having phone calls with some of their backbenchers who were taking time out of their busy schedules to talk to a campaigning organisation who probably didn't see eye to eye on, a lot of things. But that work was going on. Labour were extremely powerful during the pandemic for that reason, because groups of the MPs were working together on particular issues. But coming out of the pandemic, the sense we have actually is that Labour has become more organised in its messaging, particularly in their manifesto proposals for the next general election and beyond. And we feel that that has actually put down barriers, and we're getting less engagement from Labour MPs than we used to, which is hugely concerning. And this winter, when I was talking about those emergency parliamentary briefings we ran, the way that we do that is we invite MPs, we send out invitations, we wait and see what messages come back. Sometimes we involve the public and we send thousands of letters to MPs as a massive group. And then what often happens is the members of the public will send us what they get back from their MP. So we're able to track it, and we keep documents, archives of all of it's very arduous, but it's useful. You can watch what they do over time. We keep these documents showing the hundreds of MP responses, and we look for stock replies from the parties. We didn't used to get those stock responses that were created by central communications departments from Labour. It used to be clearly that MP writing what they thought in an email. Yeah. But now we get sort of, sorry to hear you're concerned, beyond the next election, we're going to fix X, Y, and Z. And that, to us, from the opposition, the political opposition, that's really concerning.
But it's interesting. It's also perhaps not surprising. I mean, we were talking about this just before we started, weren't we? A symptom of a risk-averse party desperate to control messaging in the build-up to an election that is really theirs to lose.
I think you're absolutely right. I also find it devastating because I think there's a lot of chat about what campaigners do, and that we're political, that we're activists, that we're troublemakers, that we're rabble-rousing. We're a group of doctors, we're not political by background, really. We're interested in systemic problems and calling attention to patient safety and staff safety, and the recognition that politicians are putting political ambition above the safety of the public is really horrifying to us. That's really horrifying, and it's scary. And one doctor actually tweeted over the winter, and it stuck with me, I suppose, the number of people dying this winter because they couldn't access safe healthcare is the same number of people who would die if a jumbo jet crashed every single week and everybody on board died. And yet, are we talking about it? Is it in the media? I've not seen anything recently about it. And it's June, and we know what happens. It goes slightly quieter in the summer, and then it will ramp up again in the autumn, and we'll be in the same position, I suspect.
Well, your description of the collapse is pretty compelling. I find that 500 excess avoidable deaths per week pretty compelling, and the source is the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. So I buy that. But let's go back a bit to the roots of the crisis. In the middle of the book, you have a chapter headed Method, which basically itemizes how this is being done. A key component of that is the burdensome cost of PFI. What is it, 50 billion a year? No, it's not 50.
No, it's not 50 billion a year. It's several billion a year.
There's a total debt burden of 50 billion for PFI hospitals built a long time ago, right? But I'm particularly interested in the outsourcing, and I recommend to everybody the EveryDoctor interactive map, in which you can zoom in and see where in the whole of the UK.
Yes, although it is primarily England that this has become a problem.
Services are being outsourced, and so when you zoom out, the whole map is covered in red splodges, which indicate services being outsourced. I went into my local hospital, King's, in southeast London, and there's a useful reference to Viapath, an outsourcer doing pathology, blood screening, I guess. So my question is, isn't there, in a sense, something quite sensible about finding the most cost-effective way, given the service will always be pushed for cash? I mean, there will always be competing for public funds, to find the most cost-effective way of doing those services?
Well, there has been some information shared to show that it's not more cost-effective in various ways. The administrative costs of running these tendering contracts is really high. And you're right in the sense that the NHS budget gets bigger and bigger every year, and there are inefficiencies. But I think the question is bigger than that, quite frankly. I think if you can, that's the problem that politicians sometimes get themselves into, I think. They think in a short-term way about what seems cost-effective from one year to the other. And you lose that broader, really important point, which is that when the system is connected and linked up and run publicly, there's a lot of collaborative working that can benefit patients, and you lose all of the bureaucracy and problems that cause when you churn these contracts, because a lot of these contracts are short term, right? So I don't know about Viapath actually.
No, it's just an example.
I think they've been working there for a while, but lots of these contracts are entered into for a short period of time by private providers or other non-profit providers, and they can exit if it isn't financially viable for them or attractive in other ways. And if you think about it from a patient's perspective, particularly the ones with chronic illness, that causes a lot of upheaval problems, it causes problems for staff, it causes continuity problems. And I don't think it's properly thought through, really. I think if we really wanted to save money in the NHS, we need to look at it as a system as a whole. How much value does it have to the public? There's a lot of talk about the cost, but there's not a lot of talk about value. And when you look at any poll from the public about, what are the public services that are the most meaningful to you, or what do you value the most in our society, the NHS is right there at the top, right? And so why don't politicians place that importance on it in a long-term way, in a sustainable way that's going to improve people's lives?
Sorry, am I missing? Hi. Yeah.
My name's Claire Goodwin. I'm the CEO of Frontline 19. We support the NHS and Frontlines with free counselling, and we've done so for the last nearly 4 years. I wanted to come at this from a patient perspective because my dad has kidney failure and has dialysis, and he was recently in King's, fantastic hospital. However, when it came to him stepping down from his treatment and needing dialysis in the community but still needing to be in hospital, they weren't able to do it because the contract says this and they can't go outside the parameters of that. So the first time my dad had dialysis, he had to go from a Kent hospital right the way up into London with quite significant delirium, very, very poorly, with a raging sepsis type infection, and it was a 12-hour round trip. And my dad is in his late 70s, has got heart problems, he's got quite complex medical needs. I ended up having to fight tooth and nail to get him a local provision. And I even did all the phoning around to all the different private suppliers to say, could you do this in the community? Can you? And in the end, he'd been in bed for 2 months in King's. We ended up having to do it in a chair in a dialysis unit out in Bromley, which really wasn't fit for what he needed, but it was the only option we had. And there are many, many patients. There's a guy that comes from Tunbridge Wells right the way up to Bromley. It takes over an hour, and he has to do that 3 times a week. And the dialysis takes 4 hours. You add the travelling time and the waiting time. These people are losing days and days and days. And the thing is, it isn't cost effective.
So just to be clear, the dialysis is provided by a private firm?
Yeah.
It is?
Yeah, many of them are.
But obviously free to you?
It is free to us, but it's very inflexible because, again, they have very set contracts about what they can and can't do. But also, when you look at the areas that they cover, and even if you look at the transport provision, because at the end of dialysis, you are exhausted. It's like you've run a marathon and people need to go home and rest overnight and kind of, you've got people that are very sick. And this affects all age groups. And these people are having to do hour, 2 hour, 3 hour journeys back home again.
And you've obviously looked into this. From the research that you've done, do you have any sense of how this would have been handled 10 years ago?
It would have been something where somebody, because it's any kind of public sector, it's about talking to someone else and saying, we've got this patient, this is what we need, can you help? No, but so-and-so can. And it's that community of the whole kind of NHS together. Now it is completely fractured and split apart. One part doesn't know what the other part's doing. So the dialysis part doesn't always correlate with the hospital that you're in.
It's a really, really important point.
Right.
If you think about the NHS as a system, it's a load of interlinked services, and those services talk to one another all the time because patients are often using multiple services at the same time, and everybody's ability within the staff to provide a good service for patients does come down to how effective those relationships are between different teams. If you've got changing teams or teams who, like you were describing, are very limited in what they can provide, and you have to come this way and you've got to book transport, but oh no, the transport hasn't turned up for 10 hours. Often the person who loses out is the patient, And I think a lot of this is short-termist, quite frankly. There's a lot of focus at the moment on patient choice. Politicians saying, patients should choose between where they want to go for their treatment. Quite frankly, I think most patients would be quite happy going to their local facility if it worked. I mean, I don't think, from my experience, I don't think patients are that fussed about choosing, as long as they have a decent service where they are. But they don't. Yeah. A lot of them don't at the moment.
And the choice isn't there.
No.
I phoned round 16, 17 hospitals to try and get him dialysis so he could move closer to home. My mum's in her late 70s. We tried everything. And the same with the transport. They awarded a new contract to SVL, which is a transport company. Right. It was absolute chaos. People waiting 7-8 hours to be taken home. But nobody ever goes back to these contracts and says, actually, that's not good enough. What are you going to do about it? It's like, once you've got the contract for that period of time, that's it. And it only gets re-looked at when it comes up for tender again. So the patient loses any kind of choice. It's like, well, that's all there is, so you've just got to get on with it.
This is really interesting. Thank you very much. Suddenly the volume seems to have gone up. Maybe that's maybe my hearing has suddenly got better. But from what I'm hearing and from what the book says, a lot of this creeping privatisation, if we can use that as a shorthand, is ad hoc. Short-term contracts awarded by regional or local trusts. Am I right?
There is that aspect of it. Definitely, I agree. It sounds like it's getting louder, doesn't it? There's so in the book, what I describe is that over the last 4 decades, there's been various reforms of the NHS that have been implemented, and each of those reforms have allowed more and more privatisation to infiltrate the service. So first of all, there was an open marketplace that was introduced between services competing with one another. And we've moved on now to there's thousands of outsourced services run by private healthcare providers and others. And you can see it that these are sort of individual coming in and competitively winning a tender. But systemically, there's also changes happening that are making it easier and easier for the private companies to come in now. So last year, the Health and Care Act 2022 came in, and that broke the NHS in England up into 42 what are called integrated care systems. Yeah. And each of these reforms just fragments the system further and further. We're starting to hear from tendering happening at the moment as well, where it's easier for the big private providers to come in and win bids rather than the existing NHS services, because they're very slick and very good at filling out these application forms and looking absolutely fantastic. And there was a GP surgery up in Lancashire a few months ago where the existing GP who'd been working in her village surgery for many years and was very well thought of and had really great satisfaction ratings with her patients, lost or looked like she was going to lose a bid against a private healthcare provider coming in. And the local patients were really cross about this and pushed back, and she's been temporarily allowed to keep her contract. But the marking criteria for who wins a bid makes it a lot easier for these big companies with fantastic HR departments to win bids compared to, you know, single GP working a partnership on her own. I mean, so over time, yes, it's individual circumstances. You can look at it like that. Mm-hmm. But across the country, I mean, you've only got to look at that map to see what's going on. It's growing. I mean, it's happening more and more.
Let me put to you what a doctor said to me today when I mentioned that we were going to be having this chat. Let me get this right. Forgive me. No, you don't want to go down the American route, in other words, wholesale privatisation. But no one really believes that's happening. Have we seen some, excuse the technical language, shite public-private partnerships? Yes, especially during COVID. The one with Michelle Mone, another technical term, us. But he said that privatisation versus full public ownership a la 1948 is not the debate, it's how you shape that partnership. In other words, there is another view from staunch defenders of the service that this partnership with the private sector is kind of inevitable. Do you agree, or do you either fundamentally disagree or find that as a campaigning organisation you've got to keep the message simple?
I don't think it's to keep the message simple because we're not politicians. I mean, I suppose what I would suggest is that we look at the evidence that's coming out. We're not ideologically opposed to privatisation for any kind of political reason. The reason our organisation are opposed to it is because we believe it's bringing harm to patients and harm to staff, actually. There's instances now where private providers are taking over services and staff are having a bad time of it. But there was a study, we were talking about this before we came in, weren't we? An observational study came out in the Lancet last year. It's the first study of its kind, and it looked at the impact of private companies running NHS services, and there was an excess mortality increase, which means that avoidable deaths look like they've happened in an increased way in the areas that have had more private outsourcing going on. Now, we're in the early days with this, and I think when you're in the early days of a systemic change of the magnitude that's happening at the moment, you know, I don't want to say something with absolute certainty when this observational study is the first of its kind, but what's coming out looks really worrying. And anecdotally, you know, we run a network of 400,000 people. You wouldn't believe the number of stories we're hearing from patients who just anecdotally are having a bad experience. I think that needs to be paid attention to. I think you will sometimes have people saying, oh, you know, the NHS has always had a degree of privatisation, or this is inevitable. But any of this is inevitable is, to my mind, nonsense, because the NHS itself wasn't inevitable. No public healthcare system is.
Right.
You know, we could rebuild it the way we wanted it to be.
Yes, which leads neatly on to this question of solutions. And your solutions, there's a whole chapter on them, are ambitious and expensive, aren't they? First of all, you say you've got to get staff to return, revive CapEx investment programs across the service, pay off that PFI debt, and then end outsourcing, update the tech and the estate, and pay proper attention to diversity in leadership. Mm-hmm. Basically, and fundamental to that is go back to full public funding of the whole service. Confession time. In a previous job, I used to be part of the sort of media blob that wrote some of these sort of opinion pieces for the Times, not under my own name, channeling the view of the paper, which I don't think were ideological, but they did ask the question, how do we go on paying for comprehensive healthcare free at the point of need as healthcare gets more and more expensive and the population gets older? Mm-hmm. Do you accept that that's a pretty serious problem, given, from the perspective of a chancellor, who's trying to divvy up public funds?
So first of all, okay, so three things I would say. So any plan for the NHS is expensive. Yeah. Any change you want to make, it's an enormous system, and it gets more expensive every single year because medical things change, healthcare develops, our expectations develop, right? So absolutely. Plus we have an ageing population. So that absolutely anybody putting any kind of plan for the NHS is going to be looking at an enormous sum of money. Secondly, I think what we need to focus on is the fact that one of the reasons we're in the situation we are right now is because it has been neglected so significantly by this current government. We're in a situation now where we have an over £10 billion repair bill in the NHS in England alone because they've just let walls crumble. In the last 18 months, we've had hundreds of sewage leaks onto A&E departments, maternity units, cancer wards, because they're not fixing the basic things. So one of the reasons that this plan would cost a lot of money is because things haven't been paid for, right? So that's number two. And number three is, and I talk about this in the book, we need to think about what is written in the NHS Constitution. What is the promise of the NHS? Because we're not fulfilling it at the moment. And my feeling about it is that politicians are either going to have to make these radical changes in order to fulfill those promises, which are free healthcare, healthcare which is comprehensive, healthcare which is equal, or they hold a public referendum and they say to the public, would you like us to change the NHS Constitution because we're not going to provide these things anymore? Because currently they're not providing the things, but the public want them to. And when the public ask for it, they're told it's going to cost too much. And I think that's nonsense. I think we need to be holding these politicians to account, regardless of the party.
Do you think a referendum would be necessary before switching or moving to the kind of insurance-based system which we do read about, not just in the States, but more of a mixed system a la France and Germany?
Absolutely. I think there should have been a referendum, before last summer, before they broke the NHS into 42 units. I think they should have held a referendum before introducing private finance initiatives that have landed us with, in total, £80 billion worth of debt for buildings which were worth £12 billion. They didn't do any of these things. Politicians have got away with this because we are in a situation where our public healthcare system is managed in a short-term way by whichever government comes in. And if you look at what the public wants, actually, regardless of who they vote for, most people want the NHS to survive and most people believe in the principles. And so politicians aren't following what the public want them to be doing at the moment. There's so much unhappiness about it, and I think sometimes, and this is slightly defensive, as a campaigner and as a campaign organisation, we get boxed in. People often like to label us in a particular way. You're socialists, you're activists, you're blah, 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 blah. We've got no political agenda other than wanting the NHS to survive and wanting people to be safe. We're not politicians. We never will be politicians, right? What we see politicians doing is not safe, and we want to call attention to that.
I do want to ask you a little bit about how it's been for you making the transition from being a doctor to a campaigner, because we actually had a ThinkIn in here a couple of weeks ago honouring campaigners who'd won. Remind me of the name of the prize. Anyone? Sorry?
Sheila McKechnie.
Sheila McKechnie Prize, yes. And it was a really interesting insight into the fact that it's never simple and it's never stress-free, quite the opposite. But I would like to hear from anybody else who's had experience of private healthcare at taxpayers' expense, as it were, and whether you think that it's adequate or whether your experience supports the finding of this Lancet study published last year that, broadly speaking, care is lower quality. Yes. Do you want one of these? Yeah.
I can do. My voice is really
Your voice is...
Probably a
Whoops.
good idea.
There you go.
Thanks. I'm Ash. I'm a consultant in acute medicine. So very little private healthcare going on in acute care from what I see. But I go back to that story of tendering. And once we open up the offer of profit from acute healthcare, from primary healthcare, we will fail because we don't have the expertise in tendering. I have seen my trust again and again and again go for the cheapest provider from a private provider, because people who are expert at tendering for contracts will write the right thing to get the job. And that happens so frequently. I mean, on a 3-monthly basis for clinical systems, for e-prescribing, for pharmacy services, just the smallest things. And these are within one small trust in North London. We do not have the expertise to know who are going to do this better. So we should not allow it until we have that expertise, or not allow it at all. But we've jumped in and go, oh, that sounds really good. They've told us they can do it for this much money. And to a ICS, or as was Strategic Health Authority, or a CCG, that appeals to the bottom line for this financial year.
Yeah.
And we keep running to financial year to financial year. And cost versus value. We have got it so wrong when we talk about healthcare. We know that public healthcare is the cheapest way of providing the most healthcare to the most people. But we've somehow failed to make that argument. We keep, and it's happened tonight, we keep talking about cost, expense. It is such a cheap way of doing healthcare.
And the broader benefits to having a healthy population as well get completely missed. If you think about the state of the country and the state of people's health, and that healthy people are more productive and will help the economy, that seems to have been completely lost in recent years, doesn't it?
We never talk about Nationalised Health Service as a wealth generator, which is what it is.
Yeah.
Because those arguments of how, especially the Conservative Party, have talked about how we use healthcare, choice.
Yeah.
It is built around people who are not the main users of healthcare. It's built around people who are using healthcare around their healthy working lives. And actually, that's not the majority of our, of healthcare users. So actually get it right for the majority, the people with the greatest needs, the people who suffer health inequalities, and the trickle down will go to those other people who want the best services.
Yeah.
But we always seem to pander to the people who can choose, and people with complex health needs, people who I meet in A&E every single day with dementia, with mental health problems. They are not the people who can make choices. And we are taking away the holistic approach to their care, and it will fail us and it will fail them.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I come back, while you have the mic, to what in a sense was your starting point? Correct me if I'm wrong, but morale. How's morale in your team? And you mentioned, what made me think of this was you mentioned that public healthcare provision is the cheapest, the most cost effective, in fact. That being the case, do you feel abused rather than used as the provider of that healthcare?
Maybe, no, I don't actually. And every day I'm in there looking after people, I don't feel abused. And I feel like I'm part of the same tribe of people as the people I look after. So it's not an us and them. And having to explain, I stopped apologising years ago. I don't apologise for the long stay. I say, I hate that this is happening.
You don't apologise for the...
For the long stays in A&E.
Okay.
Right. It's not my responsibility any longer. This is a system in which we are all being forced to work, and it is brutal, and the burnout levels are huge.
There's often, sorry to cut in, there's often a line that comes from the media or from politicians that tries to divide patients and NHS staff. And for the first point, I mean, NHS staff make up 5% of the population. They are the population. But secondly, as Ash was saying just now, the staff are dealing with a set of circumstances which are not of their making. They've been created by politicians, and they're doing a fantastic job working incredibly hard within an incredibly difficult working environment. But I mean, I would very rarely come across an NHS staff member who blames the patients for any of the conditions. I think there's a pretty general view now that it's not the patient's fault either, you know? Things have been cut back so significantly that, you know, there's sometimes nonsense in the media about patients approaching healthcare and they didn't need to and they're clogging up A&Es. It's just, you know, if somebody goes to A&E, even if they didn't need to, they're going into our public healthcare system because they've got a problem and they want some help, even if that help is reassurance. It would be a very unusual staff member who would get cross about that. The staff members are very understanding about the fact that, you know, we have this fantastic system. One of the best things about the NHS is that you can go to A&E if you're worried. And sometimes you didn't need to be there in the first place. How fantastic, you can go home again. You know, that's wonderful. Because someone in the States might not feel the ability to do that. They'd probably sit at home and try an over-the-counter medication. And we know what happens there. In the States, it's the biggest cause of bankruptcy. Over 500,000 families every single year go bankrupt because of medical problems. We don't want that here. It's not going to be good for anybody.
No, absolutely. I remember interviewing a guy called Wendell Potter. Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah, I've got his book.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And absolutely heart-rending descriptions of doctors giving their time at county fairgrounds and queues of cars arriving with people needing everything from a cataract to a, I don't know, tooth out. Yeah, and he wept. Yeah.
I mean, there's staff weeping, you know, maybe not right here, right in this room, but there's staff crying now. The staff leaving profession, moving abroad, retiring early, because the stress of working in a system where you're meant to be providing one thing, but you're not given the tools to provide it, that, you know, the stress and the strain that puts on people is unbelievable. It's not right. And staff, and I'm, you know, as an advocate of the staff struggle to speak up sometimes. It's difficult. Working in the NHS is a fantastic place, but also it can be a brutal working environment. There's not a lot of room sometimes because things are so busy, and people, as they get more and more stressed out, have less capacity to listen to one another. It's very, very difficult. And so some people are just turning away from it and leaving. And, you know, there's a lot of talk at the moment about numbers of new staff we're going to get. You know, we're going to get 5,000 of these people or 10,000 of these people. And there's very little focus on the fact that we're losing this absolute wealth of knowledge, experience that we already have. You know, because if you look at it in a graph, one new doctor equals one who had 30 years experience but has less because they're having difficult mental health problems, for example. That person with 30 years experience, we've lost them. And a member of staff who has that amount of experience is so valuable. It's not, you know, that's lost by politicians as well, I think, at the moment.
I think part of the problem is, though...
Have you got a mic?
Part of the problem is that I personally believe the political system is working against the NHS. They're not interested in recognising and reformatting or kind of building it back up again. Because if you look at it in context, a lot of people have earned a lot of money out of private contracts. Matt Hancock during the pandemic, 40 million to an ex-pub landlord that was a friend of his. I mean, I could go on for hours about lots of contracts that were given out that were, you know, not fit for purpose. Michelle Moan, you mentioned her earlier on. I personally don't think there's any interest or any benefit to them to actually rescue this. I also think they lost interest when the NHS stopped being a sexy cause, and you know, when you look at the flow of information from general media, from politicians and down, what they do is they take it out of context. People are having to go at A&E and they're waiting hours, and some of them only need to see, you know, a doctor for antibiotics. There's nearly 10,000 GP vacancies in England alone at the moment, out of 26,000. People can't get to see their GP. It's not because they're not bothered. We don't have the GPs. When you look at the costs of people moving to Australia, the fact that the other day there was a strike of junior doctors and there was a billboard going past on a truck advertising jobs in Australia for £130,000 starting fee. They certainly don't get that here. There are lots of issues around. I'm not saying the NHS is perfect, it's not, but it is actively being dismantled in front of our eyes. We work with 9,000 NHS staff a week. Many of them are actively feeling very low morale, depressed, anxious. Many are suicidal. We have lots that are actively suicidal. They are burnt out, they're exhausted. Some of it's trauma, and not just from the pandemic, it goes before and after that. And it's immoral, because it can be such an amazing system. And as the lady over there said, you know, about it being cost effective, we are heading with our eyes shut into a situation where private healthcare will be the norm. And nobody's talking about it, and yet people want to, but no one's addressing it. No one will put it out in the media. We fight tooth and nail to get statistics and things out there. People don't want to know about it. We did a campaign called Hopeline 19, where general public could leave messages for NHS and frontline workers saying how, you know, grateful they were and their own experiences of the NHS. We had 20,000 phone calls in 3 days. It barely breached general media, because people weren't interested in it, because it was a good story and it was positive news. And yet lots of staff phoned it, thousands phoned it, and lots of Joe Public phoned in. But people don't want it. They want to see the headlines, this is really awful and the NHS is not fit for purpose and it's going to cost lots of money. The government have an active agenda not to make this work. That is my personal opinion.
Well, you mentioned the lorry driving past with the job ads in Australia, and staff at all levels leaving for other walks of life, other countries. Let's talk about staffing. Julia and Ash, if you want to pitch in. Is that a form of creeping privatisation? Because where there are gaps that have to be filled in surgeries, but particularly in hospitals, if I'm not mistaken, they're often filled by agency staff. Do you regard that as a form of creeping privatisation? Is that where we're going?
Do you want to go first, Ash?
I think it relates to cost and value of the healthcare staff that we have working in the NHS.
Let's give Ash a mic.
Oh, okay, sorry.
There we go. Yeah.
I think it relates to, you know, how much we're willing to train enough of the people to provide the care for the population we have. So realistically, we need a huge increase in doctors, nurses, allied health professionals to meet the needs of an ageing population. That is going to cost a lot of money. There has been a cut of 40% of the budget for Health Education England, who supervise the training of healthcare professionals. There are limits on the number of trainees that I can recruit. There are limits on, you know, I can have a contract for 12 months, but I can't have a permanent contract because, you know, that person may not stay and we're not sure if we've got the budget line next year. I'll lose that advanced practitioner or that clinical fellow to Australia very quickly. And those gaps and the discomfort and the disquiet and just sheer exhaustion of my junior colleagues, of course there's going to be market forces then. Yeah. And they will say, I will work and I will do this work, but it's nearly intolerable work because of the pressure they're under. So yeah, they're going to ask for £100, £120, and people are going to see there's money to be made. I work in acute care, we're underserved. I get an email every single day offering me between £5,000 and £7,000 a week to go and work as an agency locum somewhere in the UK. But I decide not to. But given where I am and the value that's put on the work that I do, why wouldn't I? I wouldn't, but that creep, that pressure is just there every single day.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Ash says, and it's difficult because the permanent staff have been treated really badly for a really long time now, and they've had massive real-term pay cuts. As consultants in England since 2008, 2009 have had a 34.9% real terms pay cut. It's enormous, and so in a way, you know, it's obvious that people are going to experience that and experience the stress and strain at work, and eventually they'll be tipped over into thinking, is this the right thing for me? Should I be looking for somewhere else? Not even just for themselves, quite honestly, it's often people who I hear from who say, you know, I'm doing this because my husband can't take me being this stressed, you know, it's affecting my relationship, or I'm worried about my children and I don't see them enough. You know, there's all these kinds of reasons people make these decisions. But as Ash says, if you do that to a workforce for long enough, for over 10 years, people are going to start making personal choices to keep themselves, quite frankly, safe. That's what I hear. And some of those people go into the locum agency workforce, some of them work for a private provider themselves, some of them move abroad. Something I do struggle with a little bit, because I get this a little bit online, is this implication that it's the staff's responsibility to continue working regardless of the conditions, and they just need to be a foot soldier and put up with it all. And that's nonsense, because the workers in the NHS are workers. They should be paid fairly for what they do. They should be respected and treated well, and they're not. So it's up to the government to make the job more supportive of a workforce, I think.
I don't have personal experience with this. My partner is a clinical psychologist in the NHS, so it's under a slightly different contract to doctors. He's getting a promotion. He's running the adult clinical psychology services in Hackney. Guess what he gets for his promotion? Nothing for 5 years. Zero. I work in the private sector. If anyone offered me a promotion where my pay came in after 5 years, I would instantly quit my job. That would be utterly unacceptable. Can you imagine? But that pay grade doesn't even account for inflation over 5 years, and you don't see any of it. Now, that is relying on the goodwill and, you know, kindness and generosity of these people who take pride in their work. But if you ask anyone in the private sector, would you accept this as a work contract? They wouldn't, because it's fundamentally unfair. And I think that the heart of this issue for me is, it is immoral what we're doing. Like, should we be thinking about healthcare as a cost optimization system, or is it about driving the fundamental good of human life, which is, if you are healthy, you can do anything. If you have no health, you can do nothing. And why are we optimizing like we're a private organization when that's not what health is about? It's not that at all.
That's absolutely key. And I think that's the point here. When we talk about value, it's so easy to get trapped in these arguments of this doctor's working for such and such an hour, or like this is going to cost lots of money at the net and we don't have it in the budget. If we thought about this in a broader way, really, like, what do we want from our society? How do we want our society to function? It wouldn't look like this. Like, the health inequality is extraordinary, and it's scary, and it's getting worse. And we need to have these big conversations, and, you know, I think it's up to the public to make those decisions, you know? It's not up to politicians. I guess that's the reason I wrote the book. I feel like there's not enough information getting out to people about what's happening. People get divided, and it becomes politicized. And actually, we could all just have a conversation with one another. We seem to have lost the ability to do that.
We certainly have. The flag's gone up, which doesn't mean we're completely out of time. Sarah, did you want to say something about it? Yes.
So this is slightly off track of where the current questions were going, so forgive me. But so I know in the US lately, there's been an emphasis on bringing in doctor level medical professionals into hospitals more and more. So like physician's assistants and nurse practitioners, as a way of kind of, I guess, alleviating the amount of work. And I was wondering, thinking money aside, is that something that you think would really work in hospitals in the UK? How do you feel about that approach to when it comes to patient care and that kind of stuff, and how it kind of comes to I guess maybe having a bit more of like a community health and public health focus, and so putting some of the practitioner, I don't know what the right word is, on people that aren't just doctors, but kind of having another set of medical professionals within the hospital system to help with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few doctors in the room, like other people might want to talk about this. My personal view on this, and it's not an attack on any group of staff members at all, is that there's a move at the moment, just like there is in the US, to de-skill the workforce and reduce the cost. And so we're probably moving into a system where you have fewer senior doctors, for example, around, managing a workforce of less highly skilled professionals of whatever background. And like Ash was saying, if you're the consultant on call, you're probably supervising a number of people now who aren't always in a training scheme, haven't always had the same level of experience they might have done a decade ago. So there is definitely a move to that in this country. In terms of that affecting patient care, I don't really feel equipped to talk about this because I'm not working in service at the moment. I don't know if anybody else wants to.
It does, it's already here. When my dad was in hospital, everybody on the wall, there were 2 doctors, 1 sister, and there must have been, say, 30 patients at least. Every single other member of staff was a healthcare assistant, and they were doing all the observations, doing all the charts. They were put under immense pressure and put in situations they should never have been put in because they didn't have the experience or the knowledge. And I think the difficulty is they're trying to help each other out and do different things, but patient care dropped massively. And also you get people, you talk about the workforce, there are a lot of overseas workers coming into the UK, and they don't have the experience of our healthcare system and maybe some of our cultures, but also they're put in very difficult positions in the care that they're asked to give. And so they just come in for one, and a lot of them walk out. I went in several times and had to stay with my dad overnight because he couldn't be left on his own, and there were no staff to sit with him. And this was in King's in London, so it's not a little hospital in the middle of nowhere. It's happening all across the country. Corridor care, all of these different horrible things that people are having to go through. The general public think that people being cared for in corridors is kind of because it's an emergency. No, it's a standard procedure now. It's even got a name, and they even do training in it. This is nothing
What's the name
new.
of it?
Corridor care. So if somebody... When my dad was in hospital, there were people in the corridor for days on end on beds, trolleys, what have you.
But that's not an official term, right? That's,
Yeah, it is. Oh, yes, it is. If you look at the
It's not
RCN...
just black humour.
No, it's called corridor care. There are papers on it about how to do it, and they train staff in how to do corridor care.
One of the hospitals this winter was training junior doctors of how to provide life-saving treatment in the back of an ambulance in an ambulance bay, because they recognised they weren't going to get lots of the patients into the A&E department because the A&E department was clogged up. And so they got an old ambulance and they kitted it out, and they had people running simulation training in an ambulance bay, because that was the reality. You know, I heard about hospitals where one consultant would be in the ambulance bay their entire shift because the patients are there and they're not going to get inside the hospital, so you better get used to treating them in the back of an ambulance. I mean, it's scary.
People being on drips in car parks and in their cars because there isn't the care there. There's not the staff. There's not the space.
Okay, the flag has gone up, which usually means we have 5 minutes. We haven't even got to asking you about your experience as a campaigner, which I wanted to. The other thing, that'll have to wait. The other thing that we haven't got to, but I do want to give you the last word on this, is how you see this playing out, given the sort of ambiguous signals that we're getting from Labour. Let's just assume Labour wins, right? Let's just assume that, broadly speaking, they are more in favour of an old-style, properly funded NHS if the money's available. But you have your doubts, and we've had some extraordinary stories of crushing workloads, devastating blows to morale. Is it like the frog in the frying pan? I think it may be an apocryphal frog in a frying pan that just gets, I'm talking about the service generally and the staff in it, this gets hotter and hotter until it realises it's over. And then we really will have a total collapse, or is it a longer, grislier, even grislier story that you foresee?
If Labour come into government, I've been reading about this a lot because I wrote an article about it yesterday, actually. I was reading a speech that Keir Starmer made about 3 weeks ago in Essex about his future plans for the NHS, and some of it does look fantastic. He's got really big plans for changing technology and investing in various areas and doing more joined-up care. I mean, if it comes to pass, let's see. Something that worries me slightly, well, it worries me quite a lot, is that he made a pledge when he was becoming Labour leader to remove the private outsourcing, and he dropped the pledge, and he's dropped a few other pledges. So I think difficult to know with his proposals at the moment how much they're subject to change. You know, I think there's a lot of people wondering that. But the other thing worrying me is that there's not enough focus on the workforce from what I'm seeing from Labour at the moment. The reality is that we've got an absolutely crippled workforce. We're missing 124,000 full-time staff in England alone at the moment. And of the staff who are currently there, a huge proportion of them have low morale and are thinking about leaving. If I was to come in and run the health service, the first thing I would be doing is looking at the staff, because none of his grand plans are going to come off if he doesn't look after the staff properly. He needs to really take the trade unions seriously and what they're saying about pay. And some of the tone of communication that I've seen, particularly from Wes Streeting, I mean, I don't know what everybody else thinks in this room, but I have found it really unhelpful. I think if you're coming in and you're trying to support and listen and learn from a group of people who've been keeping the country safe, then work with the unions, work with the healthcare professionals and the experts, listen. It feels like he's just going on the attack. And watching that, I mean, it just doesn't feel good. I don't know what anyone else thinks about that.
Well, if you've got views on Wes Streeting, have another drink and come and share them with us. But Julia, thank you very much for coming in. I've learned a tremendous amount, which I will pass on to my son with encouragement to stick at it.
Well, can I say something finally? Because I think it's good to finish on a hopeful note.
Yeah.
There are more and more people talking about this and more people connecting. I mean, we talk to a lot of people online, but it's affecting people in their lives now, their personal lives. They're asking questions, and I think we do have a moment to change things now. And I would say, I mean, I'm not working clinically as a doctor. There is still, the medical profession is a fantastic career, and you know, we've got to rebuild this service so that it's a good place to work again and a good place for patients. But I mean, it's fantastic that he's become a doctor, and we should be really grateful. And we, you know, do you know, like, but it can't all be doom and gloom. We built the NHS in the first place. We could rebuild it.
On that note, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching that video. There's plenty more over on our channel, so just click here to subscribe.